Dr. Stuart Munch is going to be our first presenter. He is an ecosystem scientist that works for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, Northwest Fisheries Science Center. His job is to use data to tell ecological stories that allow people to make informed decisions. He works on nearshore ecology and fisheries issues along the US coast. Stu earned his Bachelor of Science from Gonzaga University and PhD from the University of Washington. So I'm going to let Stu take it away. So if you want to share your screen, Stu.
Sounds good. So thanks for that introduction. Yeah, I'm really excited to share some work that I've been involved with as a grad student. So I wrapped up grad school in 2016, and as part of that work, I basically had to get familiar with nearshore ecology and the way that we build along shore can affect nearshore ecology, especially with the way that salmon use habitats. So that was sort of the aim of my PhD dissertation. And then in the process of that, I sort of had to learn, I guess, a greater perspective on, like I said, the way that we build along shorelines can affect nearshore ecology. So, okay. I want to first, again, acknowledge that this is work that I did as a PhD student, and I had a lot of helpful advisors on this project. Two of them in particular were Jeff Cordell and Jason Toft. So I'm the person that's sharing these ideas today, but we all came up with them together. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. So to make sure that we are all on the same page here, I'm going to be talking about Puget Sound, which I think everyone that's listening is probably familiar with. But just wanted to call attention to the way that things are under natural conditions here along waterfronts. So we have these beaches that have a lot of sand. They have, for instance, they have an intertidal zone. They have backshore vegetation. There's a lot of wrack that washes up on shore. And so this is the natural state of a lot of the waterfronts around Puget Sound. And so these are real great places for fish like juvenile salmon because it's a place where there's a lot of small prey. So a lot of little invertebrates will grow in the intertidal zone or basically on the sea floor that's right next to the waterfront. And then there's also a bunch of insects that grow in the vegetation in the backshore. And so all of those kind of fall into the shallow water there. And then fish like salmon really are clustered up really close to the shoreline there. So it's a good place to grow quickly. And another thing is that there's not very many predators there. So when you're right next to shore, there's just not enough room for big predators, or probably enough room for big predators to feed effectively. And so this picture is a cartoon, but it's actually pretty accurate here in that if you were to go out in the middle of springtime along Puget Sound, there would be salmon right next to shore chowing down. And so these areas are sort of an out-migration corridor. So today's talk is really about two different types of shoreline modifications. That's going to be armouring and overwater structures. So armouring is essentially hard, heavy material that you put into the intertidal zone to prevent erosion. So that's typically something like concrete or a bunch of big boulders that you stack at the bottom of the concrete. And then about a third of Puget Sound's shorelines are armored. So there's a lot of it. And then I think everyone knows what an overwater structure is, but that's essentially something like a pier or a dock that shades the water below. So our story sort of kicks off, I guess, around 2007. Well, that's when the paper came out, so probably more around 2005, when people started to notice that there's a lot of these shorelines in Puget Sound that are really highly modified. In some cases, they're pretty urban. And yet there's still a lot of fish that are clustered up next to the shoreline that are trying to make use of those habitats, especially juvenile salmon. And so that brought up the question of how shoreline armoring and overwater structures are affecting the function of these habitats. And so just again, to make sure we're on the same page here, I'm going to be talking a lot about salmon, and I'm going to be talking about the juvenile stage where they've just swam out of the watershed and they're headed out to the ocean, because that's the part of their life cycle where they're going to use these waters that are right next to shore that people tend to modify. And so the way that my work came up in grad school was that there's a seawall along downtown Seattle, and they originally built that in 1934. And then in 2001, there was an earthquake that damaged the seawall and made it so that people had to replace that seawall. And so people figured if they're going to rebuild the waterfront, maybe we can do a better job at providing better fish habitat. And so we had to ask some basic questions like, do armoring and overwater structures impair fish habitat? And can we improve habitat even though we can't restore it? Can we still repair some of these lost habitat functions? And so Elliott Bay, which is the downtown Seattle waterfront, it's that body of water that borders the downtown Seattle waterfront, is sort of this experimental system where people are trying to figure out if it's possible to repair some habitat functions even within a highly urbanized area. So this is Elliott Bay. It's the waterfront that's on the bottom of the screen there, and it's a fairly large estuary that borders Seattle. Historically, it was made out of beaches and mud flats, but nowadays it's pretty much all armored. And so it's an economic center, like a lot of urban waterfronts. We can't truly restore it, and we probably wouldn't want to anyway, I guess, given current technology at least. It's a center for commerce, tourism, recreation, and transportation. And yet again, it's a place where a lot of fish and crabs are present. And so that includes Chinook chum and pink salmon. And Chinook salmon are listed as threatened under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. And these are species of cultural, ecological, and economic interest. And so kind of what I was saying before, this is an experimental system because within this fairly small strip of waterfront, you have areas that are totally not natural. So they're completely armored. It's just a pure, there's no intertidal zone. It's just a wall of concrete with boulders stacked at the bottom. I should mention this is as of, let's say, 2012. They have rebuilt the waterfront since, and I'll get back to that later. And then if you go down the street, you can go to a beach that people built that sort of mimics what you might expect under natural conditions. And then if you go underneath a pier, you have this completely novel ecosystem. There's no natural analog for an area that's under a giant pier. So what we can do is we can compare habitat use among sites with these different modifications. I'm just asking if salmon and other fish are using their habitats differently depending on how the shoreline is modified. And so I'm going to basically speed through a lot of findings from studies that I just want to point out. These are all empirical observations. These are observations that people made by netting fish or observing them underwater with snorkel or scuba, or sampling plankton directly from the water, or retrieving diets from salmon. Or in the case of surf smelt, people monitored eggs. And so again, these are quantitative empirical observations that took place for about a decade, and there's quite a bit of observation. So again, this is what we know is happening, not necessarily what we, it's what we know is happening. Okay, so the most obvious thing is that if you compare a waterfront that looks like a beach to a waterfront that looks essentially like it has a wall of concrete with boulders stacked at the bottom, is that you get different fish there, different crabs as well. So there's fish and crabs that like to burrow in the sand, and they're not going to be there if there isn't a sandy shoreline. And there's also fish that like deep rocky habitat, and they're going to be present at those highly modified seawall and riprap boulder type waterfronts. The next thing we noticed is that under, I guess not natural conditions, but the conditions where there's at least an intertidal zone, where there's shallow, sort of a sloping shallow habitat, what you're going to notice is that the very tiniest salmon are using the very shallowest waters. So this is typically chum salmon, say like in February when they're really small, they're right next to the shoreline. And as they get bigger, they sort of drift off into deeper waters. And we think it's because those shallowest areas are probably the very safest, and they might also have good prey. But as the fish get larger, they don't need to stay in as safe of areas. They don't have to limit themselves to a shallow area, which maybe limits feeding a little bit. But the point is there seems to be this trade-off where the littlest fish will use the shallowest, they'll restrict themselves to the shallowest habitats, and then they'll move offshore into deeper waters. But we saw that that only happens in areas that actually have an intertidal zone. So if you go to a seawall waterfront where the water is immediately deep next to shore, there's a lot less smaller fish there. I show just a little bit hard data here. This is essentially a histogram showing the frequency it's showing a size distribution of fish compared between low gradient shallow shorelines and armored shorelines. And essentially what this is showing is that fish are a lot bigger along those armored shorelines. You're essentially missing the smaller fish. The next thing we found is that shoreline armoring exposes salmon to predators. So again, in those deeper shorelines, you've got these fish like lingcod that prefer deep rocky habitat, and you'll find them right along the border of land and sea, which is where salmon are clustered up next to. So under natural conditions, you wouldn't see little salmon overlapping with these predators as much. The next thing we noticed is that salmon have to switch what prey they're feeding on along armored shorelines. So under natural conditions, there's a bunch of little, they call them copepods. They're these little invertebrates that salmon feed on when they're little. And especially chum salmon feed really heavily on the ones that are, they feed really heavily on the copepods that are produced in the sand. So if there's no sand there, there's none of those epibenthic copepods. And so they have to switch to feeding on a different type of prey, which we don't think is as nutritious, or maybe it's harder to catch. But the bottom line is that armoring shorelines impacts what salmon are feeding on. And again, just to kind of show you a little bit of hard data here, these are diets from small chum salmon. Each one of these dots is a single diet. And on the left panel, it's comparing the number of planktonic copepods in the diet to the number of epibenthic copepods in the diet. And it's color-coded by whether we caught these salmon at a beach or a seawall site. And so what this is showing is that it's sort of all or nothing. If you're at a beach, these salmon are going to feed entirely off of epibenthic copepods, which are the ones produced in the sand. Whereas if they're at a seawall site where there isn't an intertidal area, they have to switch over to feeding on plankton. And so the panel on the right shows that there's a little bit of nuance in this finding. It's that, you're not starving these fish by modifying the shoreline. They're still going to eat the same amount of food, but we think that the food is less nutritious. And then there was another study. This isn't one that I was involved with, but I just knew of it. And the idea is that these areas that have natural intertidal zones also have a lot of vegetation that keeps the intertidal zone a little bit colder, a little bit wetter. And then so surf, smelt, and other fish that spawn in the intertidal zone tend to have eggs that survive better along these more natural shorelines. Okay, I'm going to move on to effects of piers. I'm going to show you what it's like to go underwater next to a pier in downtown Seattle. So there's a lot of fish, there's a lot of critters, there's crab, there's algae everywhere. And then as soon as you swim underneath a pier, you just see this dramatic loss of biodiversity. And so that's kind of the issue with large piers. We showed quantitatively that basically what's happening is that there's no fish underneath the piers. We do see crabs under there for whatever reason, but these salmon, the salmon especially, seem to swim right up to the shade line that's cast by the pier and circle around for a while instead of swimming under. And then every once in a while, when we did see salmon underneath piers, they wouldn't feed there. So it seems like these areas that are underneath heavily shaded areas are providing really poor habitat for salmon. And so this is an issue in a place like downtown Seattle because there's just so many piers. There's salmon trying to migrate along the waterfront here, and then you have just this gauntlet of piers. So you can imagine if they get stuck at each one of these, instead of swimming underneath them, they just sort of mill around for some indefinite period of time. That could be an issue as far as migration goes. So to summarize everything, armoring can alter species composition. It prevents ontogenetic habitat shift. In other words, it prevents those little fish from using the habitats that they want and then moving off to deeper habitats when they want to. It exposes small fish to predators. It can reduce consumption of preferred prey, and then it can lower egg survival. And then overwater structures can reduce fish abundance, and it might interfere with the large-scale movements of migratory fish, and it prevents fish from feeding. And so I mentioned that they rebuilt the Seattle waterfront, and the idea was whether we could repair some of these lost habitat functions. We did find that built beaches provide better habitat than armored shorelines. So these pictures are of the same location. This is Olympic Sculpture Park in downtown Seattle. And we did find, my lab group, I should say, found that these built areas are providing much better habitat than just basically a straight wall of concrete. And then also, if you look at this picture, you can see that people like hanging out here too. So it's kind of a win-win for fish and people. So again, just to show this in kind of a conceptual diagram here, if we start from the left, there's some vegetation that produces insects, and ideally those insects fall in the water for fish to eat. The intertidal zone produces more prey that fish like to eat. You can get flatfish that are at these sandy intertidal habitats. And then we also saw a lot of larval fish at that site that I just showed, which is the only shallow water habitat for about a mile as you're coming out of the Duwamish River. So it seems kind of like an oasis. Something else that we figured out was that, if you can't actually build a beach because you're in a highly urbanized waterfront, you can still build an artificial intertidal zone. So this will create more prey for fish, and it still lets those small salmon use the shallowest habitats, which we think are safer. And then if you can't even do that, if there isn't enough room, you can still add texturing to the seawall, which will produce more prey for fish like salmon. And then we also did a real quick pilot study where people essentially, so this is the pier next to the aquarium, where people put in a bunch of surfaces that were designed to let light through underneath the large pier. They put them all right next to each other, so we couldn't tell which type best, but essentially they all got light down to the water beneath the pier. And so essentially what we found was that it looked like salmon were able to use those areas under light to those areas. And since I graduated in 2016, there's been a couple more graduate students that have worked on this project that are actually publishing papers, I think, right now that'll answer the question of whether or not these we call them light penetrating surfaces, if a corridor that we install along the downtown waterfront actually provides better migration opportunities right along the downtown waterfront. So just to give you an idea of what this looks like, on the left, these are little glass blocks that are built into the concrete that's over the water, and they've put those in throughout the entirety of the downtown Seattle waterfront. So that's what those grad students have evaluated. So yeah, a few more pictures of what this looks like. So you're looking on the bottom left, you're looking up at those surfaces. On the top right, there's people walking on them. And then the pictures on the bottom are showing you seawalls that are built to provide better habitat for fish like salmon. And this is also nice because it's sort of an educational opportunity, right? If you put kiosks and signage up, it's a good way for people to learn about fish ecology that's right next to a waterfront that they use a lot, but they might not be thinking about the fish that much. So yeah, you can come up with this idea of, can we do better given what our constraints are? Or if you're in we're going from left to right, you have increasing human constraints where the idea is if there's room, you can still build beaches that mimic natural habitat. If you have less room to work with, maybe you can build piers and docks that don't take up as much space right along the shoreline to reduce shading, or you can have artificial intertidal zones. And then even if you need a really urbanized waterfront, you can still build seawalls that produce a little bit better prey for fish, or put light penetrating surfaces into piers to get more light down to the water. And so, yeah, the big picture is that I talked about fish in Elliott Bay, but this is a story that seems to be generalizable to a lot of places around the world. So nearshore waters are critical fish habitat and fish nurseries around the world. People are modifying them a lot. And the efforts that people did in Elliott Bay are sort of the first of their kind. So it's kind of a pilot project that other places around the world can try to build on. And then again, I hope I mentioned that a lot of these habitat features, they're definitely not taking away from any use by people of the waterfront. In a lot of cases, they're improving it. If you think about like public parks, for instance, providing good places for people to hang out or do whatever they want to do, while they also provide good habitat for fish. So with that, I just want to acknowledge my funding and my advisor. And then if anyone needs like an overarching reference that goes over all the concepts that I addressed in this talk, there's just this one paper that addresses all of them. So I guess with that, thanks for listening, and I'll take any questions.